3, 2, 1. Dr. Jon Lothrop. And I got that right.
Yes.
Curator of the New York State Museum, right?
Curator of Archaeology at the New York State Museum.
Archaeology. All right. And specifically, you brought some fun stuff in here today. What are you specifically an archaeologist for?
Native American archaeology at the museum. So the collections that I personally oversee, there's about 2 million artifacts. Those are artifacts derived from Native American archaeological sites across New York. And we hold those collections in trust for all New Yorkers because they represent our human legacy in New York of the past. We also have historical archaeology collections and a historical archaeology curator, Michael Lucas.
All right, the big question. What do we know about these old humans in the past? When did they get to this continent? When did they get to New York State?
Those are all great questions, and they've been debated for over 100 years, and people are still passionately debating them. So the broadest consensus thinking is that ancestors of Native American peoples crossed the land bridge from Eurasia during the Ice Age after the last glacial maximum, about perhaps 25,000 years ago. That land bridge between Siberia and Alaska was exposed because during the Ice Age, all that moisture was locked up in glaciers that covered much of the planet, and sea levels were lowered hundreds of feet. And so this vast plain, the size of a continent, extended from Siberia east to Alaska. It's referred to by geologists and archaeologists as Beringia because it's in that Bering Land Sea region.
Now, I bet most people still think the way that I used to think. For the longest time, I thought the Bering Land, like when it was connected, it was a land bridge. It was just that little strip on Alaska connecting to Siberia. But it wasn't until recent years that I discovered, and what you just said, this was a massive piece of land, right?
Yes.
That it was exposed, just the water levels were lower, and people just started walking.
Yes. Well, the process of colonization, people debate about that. But that landmass itself, it was hundreds of miles, stretching hundreds of miles north and south in the Pacific. And so essentially you added an intermediate continental scale landmass that people living in Siberia could then migrate, if they had the inclination, could migrate into the New World.
Do we know how long it took for those people to get out of Africa and make all the way to Siberia?
The current consensus is that anatomically modern humans are leaving Africa about 50 to 60,000 years ago, making their way across the subcontinents and ending up in Siberia. The oldest Siberian site that I'm aware of dates to about 30,000 years ago.
Wow. So at that point, when it's been 30,000 years since they left Africa and they colonized that area of Siberia, at that point, they're just different people, right? Over 30,000 years, like that, they're different people than what they left.
Well,
like how long?
Sure,
I guess my question is
30,000 years of evolution, and they're anatomically modern humans. They're Homo sapiens living in Eastern Eurasia.
And then, okay, so they cross this big Bering Land. It's hard to visualize like how this happens, right?
Well, there's three sets of data that are relevant here. One is geology, one is population genetics, and one is archaeology. And the geology tells us, as it's currently conceived, is that there are glaciers in Alaska and further east and further south that would prevent people from migrating east or south until about 15 or 16,000 years ago. So the thinking is that these people must have moved out onto the landmass of Beringia. They couldn't move south into the Americas until about 15 or 16,000 years ago, as those glaciers were retreating as the Ice Age is coming to an end. So they had pathways along the Pacific coast, or perhaps between the two major continental glaciers, the Laurentide Glacier and the Cordilleran Glacier. And a pathway opens up between them 15, 16,000 years ago. And the belief is that humans migrated very rapidly and colonized much of the New World within a matter of a few thousand years. So the process of colonization happens very rapidly. The reason we believe that Native Americans who colonized the New World, these ancestors of Native Americans who colonized the New World, derive from Siberia, the best evidence is actually population genetics, where modern population geneticists study the genetic makeup of populations in Siberia, Eastern Asia, and Native American populations, and those share sets of genes, haplogroups, sets of genes that are only shared between populations that you see today in Eastern Asia and in the Americas. And so that's fundamentally the strongest evidence that exists that this is where Native Americans came from.
And that's all Native American tribes, everyone that they tested?
Virtually all of them.
Wow.
Yes. Now, I will say that all Native American groups have their own origin stories, and those are legitimate too. It's their perspective on how they came to be in this world. We're looking at it with data sets of archaeology and population genetics and geology, and coming up with a different narrative about the past.
Now, has this only been since, when did we start mapping the genome? I feel like early 2000s or so?
The human genome, I believe it was early 2000s.
So has this just been speculation up until then?
No, that's when the entire human genome was mapped.
Okay.
But population geneticists were working on this study before then. The picture was starting to come clear in the 1990s. And it's become increasingly more highly resolved since then as they continue to study this.
All right.
Yeah, and they're both using modern population genetics in rare cases. They're also they're extracting DNA from the human remains of an ancient individual that may have been buried thousands of years ago, and that can provide insights as well.
That's one that's always puzzled me. How do they get this DNA? Is it out of bone? I mean, that's all that's left, right? Is teeth and bone.
Teeth and bone, and my understanding is it's usually better preserved in teeth, but not necessarily.
Okay. Yeah, the whole.
And when they extract that, sometimes it's in good condition, sometimes it's partially degraded. So how much they can use that DNA of an ancient individual to draw comparisons and do broader genetic studies and figure out where they believe that individual may have ultimately derived from depends on how well the DNA preserved.
All right. So that always just the DNA part confuses the heck out of my dumb little brain, because I'm like, because this Ancestry and 23andMe and all these DNA, like, find out who you're from. I think you just send in some spit and they map your DNA. So we get the same DNA, that kind of mapping, from a bone of somebody that's 10, 15, 20,000 years old?
Yes, potentially, if it's preserved.
Now, how is it not preserved?
Well, it depends on the local geology of where this person might have either become buried naturally by natural processes after they passed away, or if they were intentionally buried, placed in a grave. Perhaps grave goods were laid in with them and then they were covered up. If they've been cremated, the chances of DNA surviving are very small. But if they've been buried and not cremated, depending on the different geological conditions at that location, how acidic is the soil. If it's very acidic, the bones won't even survive over a few thousand years. But if the soil is not acidic, and depending on the moisture content and all those other characteristics of that location, that can help or militate against the DNA being preserved.
You mentioned cremation. How do we know these people cremated each other? Or they're dead, not each other?
In cases where archaeologists stumble on these graves, human bone looks very different if it's been burned. You're left with small portions of the mineral component of the bone, and it's whitish, and it's degraded by the heat of the fire.
Okay.
As opposed to bone that is simply placed in the ground when a person is deceased.
Would that be more yellowish? Is what I'm picturing, or when? Because we always picture white bones, right?
Yes.
Just like skeleton, whatever, Halloween, white bones. But if it's burnt, if it's really white, we're assuming it's more likely to have been burnt.
Well,
Confusing question, I know.
physical anthropologists, when they see human bone that's come out of the ground, the differences between bone that's been burnt and hasn't been burnt, if it's preserved, is like night and day. So if it hasn't been burnt, it may acquire staining from the soil around it and make it a little darker.
See, I just find that fascinating from a cultural perspective. Like, when did people start cremating each other? Because it seemed around the world that all cultures burn dead bodies, and I just
It really varies significantly by cultures within regions and through time.
really.
Yes.
So we have plenty of examples of people who've never, of cultures who have
Yes.
not cremated. Okay.
Both in this world and in the old world.
All right. So we find these old. How do we know where to dig? I guess is the root question that I have. How do we know? I watch all these documentaries
For
my
the
whole life.
archaeo-
Yeah. How does an archaeologist figure out where to dig?
Well, many archaeological sites, including some of the earliest ones, are found either by accident. Somebody stumbles across an artifact that's eroding out of a riverbank, or it might be an avocational archaeologist whose hobby it is to go out and find archaeological sites, and they may walk across a farmer's field after they get permission, and they may find an archaeological site that way because the artifacts are on the surface and they've been exposed after spring plowing and the rain has washed the soil, and these artifacts just can show up on the surface. Many archaeological sites are found by professional archaeologists in the course of doing dedicated surveys looking for sites in particular regions.
What's the
So
coolest place you dug?
Perhaps northwestern Maine or Alaska or Scotland.
Whoa. That was going to be one of my questions. Have you been up to Beringia,
Yeah,
the Bering
yeah.
Strait area?
But there's plenty of fascinating and exciting archaeological sites in New York.
Yeah, let's focus on New York. What's the coolest place in New York that you've dug or that you think is the most significant?
Well, I
this
actually
stuff.
have artifacts from one of the more important sites in New York archaeology, and these are artifacts. I'm thinking maybe I should turn these sideways. These are artifacts from a site called West Athens Hill, which is located south of us, about half an hour off Route 87 in Greene County. And it's just a hilltop. And what's important about that location and was important to these first peoples of New York, Native Americans who we believe came into the region about 13,000 years ago. They're of a sort of a broader cultural manifestation that archaeologists call Paleo-Indian, meaning the first Indians, of course. It's just a name that we assign to them. We don't know what they call themselves. But we believe they migrated into the New York region, perhaps coming east from up the Ohio Valley, or perhaps coming north up the Delaware Valley, and then crossing over into the Hudson Valley. And interestingly, eastern New York, where this site is located, 13,000 years ago, if you wanted to colonize the rest of New England and the Canadian Maritimes, you had to go through eastern New York. You had to go through the Hudson Champlain Valley. That was the gateway to the rest of New England and the Canadian Maritimes. And to the north, there were still glaciers. They were retreating northward, but just across the international border, there were still glaciers 13,000 years ago.
That doesn't seem that long ago
Yeah.
to have been How thick were these glaciers? I've heard up to a mile.
Yes, a mile to 2 miles thick, and they covered at their maximum extent. They extended south down to Long Island. Long Island is just a big linear pile of gravel and soil that got bulldozed south by the glacier. They cover the rest of the state as well, except for one tiny patch in western New York called at Salamanca. But essentially, the entire state was covered by glacial ice. And so when it retreated, it started pulling back about 24,000 years ago, and New York was entirely ice-free about 13,000 years ago. And so you had this, geologically speaking, newly exposed landscape that was open for colonization by Native Americans who were already present in the Midwest and the Southeast 13,000 years ago.
That's fascinating about people. Wherever you can get to, it seems people got there.
Pretty much.
Right? Like as soon as you described, as soon as the corridor opened up, we're running through. We're like, okay, let's go that way.
Yep.
And these people were just wandering.
Yep. Homo sapiens colonized the entire globe except for Antarctica. So
it's absurd to think that they were using this and they traveled the entire continent. Like we complain about having to go to the grocery store in a car. Like, oh, it's so far. I don't want to go right now. I can't put. How old did these people typically live till? It was a rough life, right?
It was a rough life, and it's likely that they were not living typically beyond about 30 to 40. Because think about it, if you're spending your entire life outside, moving from one seasonal camp to the next, as these people did, living by hunting primarily and occasionally gathering wild plants and berries, sleeping on an animal skin on the ground, perhaps in a tent. That's a rough life. And
it's fascinating that they made it this far. Like it's unfathomable to think.
It's an amazing testimony to the ingenuity and endurance and hardiness of these early peoples.
Talk about why they needed these things. Is this the time of mastodons and woolly mammoths?
Yes.
And saber-tooth. Did we have saber-toothed cats in North America?
Not in North America, but not in New York. So if you think about this landscape, which was still an Ice Age landscape when people first arrived around 13,000 years ago, there's a continental glacier just north of the international border in Quebec. The weather this is still an Ice Age climate. You would have to go to the Labrador Peninsula, hundreds of miles to the north today in Canada, to find a subarctic environment and landscape as they were encountering when they were moving into the New York region. Another feature of the landscape, the ice had just left, and as that ice is leaving, retreating northward, the glacial front, it opened up the St. Lawrence Valley, and the Atlantic Ocean flooded the St. Lawrence Valley and created this gigantic inland sea in Quebec, Ontario, and northwestern Vermont and northeastern New York. So the Adirondacks at that time, if you were standing in the Adirondacks, you were looking at this gigantic inland sea that ran hundreds of miles east-west, called the Champlain Sea, that was inhabited by whales and seals and other cold water marine fauna that you could find on the coast of Labrador today. On the landscape itself, when people show up in this region, mammoth and mastodon are still present. Caribou, which is a herd animal that moves about the landscape seasonally, moving north and south between forests and parklands and tundra with the seasons, moving north and south. They're running around the landscape. There's Arctic fox and Arctic hare. So there's this whole subarctic fauna of terrestrial animals and birds that are living here in New York, none of which are here today. So very, very different landscape that they're coming into.
But we find these bones of these animals here, right? Like the mastodon. I know I've driven by several places in New York State that have signs saying I forget the names of
Well,
the famous
The
ones.
Cohoes Mastodon.
Okay, there's one.
Which is in the New York State Museum.
I have
today.
seen that
You
one.
can visit it now. It died about 13,000 years ago, fell into a glacial pothole after a battle with another mastodon. His skull was punctured by a tusk of another mastodon, and that was the coup de grace that killed this mastodon. And that's an example of one of these animals that's running around the New York landscape right about the time that people first migrate into the region.
So we had mastodons to deal with and woolly mammoths here in New York State. And we found woolly mammoth remains here in New York State?
Fossils of both of those and caribou have been found. Our vertebrate paleontologist Bob Foranek at the New York State Museum is actively studying Pleistocene fossil finds in New York, both to understand what animals were present during the Ice Age here, and also to understand, first of all, when they migrated into the region after the ice retreated, and when they went extinct as the climate warmed at the end of the Ice Age 11,600 years ago.
Oh my God.
So, but if you're coming into the New York region, we have a strong sense from the archaeological sites of these people that these are literally tools for survival. They're using them for hunting. They're using them for cutting up animals and butchering them to eat their meat. They're using them to process their hides so they can turn them into clothing and to tent coverings and so forth. So they undoubtedly had other artifacts were made of bone and hide and antler. Because New York has very acidic soils compared to other regions of North America, those aspects of their material culture virtually never survive to the present day. But as there's a bumper sticker that says love is fleeting, but stone tools are forever.
Right.
So stone tools like this last a very long time. They're made of stone. There's no reason for them to degrade any further. So once these people mined stone from an outcrop and made these tools, they become this essentially permanent, when those tools are thrown away, it becomes essentially a permanent marker of their presence on these ancient landscapes.
Do we see an evolution? Have you seen an evolution of New York stone? Like these arrows, these tools? I imagine they started out a bit cruder and then we refine them over time. Is there an evolution like that here in New York?
Well, there's definitely an evolution in how their toolkits change through time. It's not an evolution, though, necessarily where these stone tools are becoming more refined. These are highly refined stone tools, and the skill required to make many of them, especially the spear points that we're looking at here, these are called fluted spear points. Each one of these are finished fluted spear points. This is a base with a tip broken off, which would have happened during hunting, but they're all these earliest stone tools in New York these are 13 to 12,000 years old. You can recognize the points because they all have a groove or a flute up on each side, and this point would have been hafted in a split foreshaft like that, which was probably and lashed to seat it, perhaps with a mastic also, but using animal sinew likely to lash it to the base. And we know that because there's usually grinding on the lower edges of these points, and that in turn might have been seated, a foreshaft might have been seated in a larger dart shaft, which archaeologists believe this was not an arrow shaft, but a dart shaft that's being propelled by an atlatl, which is essentially called a throwing stick. Australian Aborigines used these in the 19th century in Australia. It's a handle of 2 to 3 feet long, and the upper end has some kind of a knock or hook that would seat into the dart shaft, and by using leverage you can propel that dart shaft much further than you could just throw it. So this becomes a weapon for hunting that when you're sufficiently trained can be lethal and very effective at killing animals like caribou.
I've seen a video of someone throwing one of those, what did you call it? What is the name of it?
Atlatl.
Atlatl.
Yes.
Throwing it at a car door. Like they're taking a door off of a car just to demonstrate how strong this thing could be. And they chucked it at the car door, and it made a solid dent. And the guy was saying, this door is harder than any other hide of any animals that lived, like the Mastodon or the woolly mammoth. That would puncture and just probably break off, and eventually the animal would just bleed out. But I was like, whoa, because looking at these, I'm like, how is anybody going to kill an animal with this? And I remember seeing that demonstration. I'm like, oh, all right, these people were onto something. They were really killing a lot of animals. Have you found any of these near fossil remains?
In a few cases, they have been found in New York in general association with Pleistocene fossils. So there's two locations, Dutchess Quarry Cave, two caves actually, in Orange County in the Wallkill Valley, and the Hiscox site in Genesee County. And those are two locations where fossils have been found of variously at Hiscox of Mastodon and caribou and California condor, and at Dutchess Quarry Cave, peccary and caribou and other Ice Age fauna. But it's not sort of the smoking gun necessarily, in that you didn't find the point stuck in the ribs of a caribou. There's questions about how those animal bones came to be at those locations, and how did the artifacts get there. And that's archaeology is all about association. You have to be able to demonstrate that things found together in a single location, perhaps in a single geologic strata, you have to be able to create a narrative based on the available data to explain reasonably how they got there and whether or not they're all associated or not. So at the Hiscox site in Genesee County in western New York, investigated by Dick Laub of the Buffalo Museum of Science for many years, these animal bones were also found in the same general geologic stratum with some Paleo-Indian artifacts, including some points. And these other tools here that look, these are called triangular end scrapers. And these are another kind of tool, also hafted. These are triangular in shape, so you can insert them in a socket handle of either wood or antler or bone. And you can then use that for preparing, for example, a caribou hide to make clothing out of it, because you want to remove the flesh off the inside of the hide, and depending on what season it is, you might want to remove some of the hair as well. So this is the kind of tool for doing that. And when you find these at these early Paleo-Indian sites, it's evidence of two things. It's both evidence of the activity, which is hide processing, usually. That's what these tools are usually used for. It also tells you about who was there. In hunting-gathering societies, sometimes women hunted, but usually men took the primary role in hunting. Women who were bearing children played equally an important role in raising children, collecting plant foods that might be present nearby, and staying with those newborns as some men went out to hunt caribou, for example. So when you find a site like West Athens Hill, and you find these points, and you find other tools like these end scrapers here, it's telling you that likely entire families were living at that site, both men, women, perhaps elders, and children. And it tells you that they're moving around this landscape as families. They're not just staying in one place and somebody's going off and going to go get stone to make tools, or they're moving around the landscape as families probably. And this site, West Athens Hill, is important because, for many reasons, but in part because it was perhaps one of the first outcrops of stone that they found when they moved into the New York region, at least eastern New York, that they needed to make these tools for survival. That particular outcrop, West Athens Hill, is known as an outcrop of this greenish stone called geologists call Norman Skill chert. It dates to several 100 million years ago. It's an outcrop that you find occasionally in the Hudson Valley on hilltops and ridges, and these people are exploiting those hilltop outcrops to mine this stone. They're using hammer stones and stone wedges and beating this stone away from the geologic outcrop, the beds of the stone in the geologic outcrop. And then at West Athens Hill, they're staying there. They're leaving tools from their encampment while they're mining this stone and making tools of this. And so when you look at the tools from West Athens Hill, most of them, these points here, and these unfinished fluted points here, and most of these end scrapers are made of this greenish, bluish gray stone that's very distinctive, Norman Skill chert. And it tells you they're mining the stone, they're making tools, they're using them, they're throwing them away during their encampment. It marks their encampment there. So it's both a lithic source for these people, and it's also a place where they're camping in the course of their seasonal travels. And when you look at this prehistoric Paleo-Indian toolkit, you notice that not all of these tools are made of this Norman Skill chert. Some of them are made of this red and brown stone. This is called jasper, and that's probably coming out of the Delaware Valley, well to the south. And that tells you that these peoples are, it's evidence that these people are moving seasonally across hundreds of miles in the landscape. This same stone that you find at West Athens Hill is also found all the way east in eastern Massachusetts at sites there, in northwestern Maine, in western New York, in Steuben County. So when you look at the artifacts of these people and you look at what particular types of stone they're made of, it tells you how they're moving around this landscape, and it testifies to how mobile these people were from one season to the next. They're covering vast territories, not just across New York, but outside New York, Pennsylvania, Maine, Massachusetts. They're not all going to those same locations. People from those different areas are coming to West Athens Hill, getting that stone and going back.
And you're finding that stone elsewhere,
yes.
which is the only indication is that they're moving very far.
Yes.
Because you can't find that stone anywhere else.
Well, there are a limited number of outcrops of this kind of stone, Norman Skill chert, in the middle and upper Hudson Valley, but it's not found anywhere else outside the Hudson Valley.
What did you call these? End scrapers? What exactly is an end scraper?
These tools are end scrapers.
They look a bit more crude than these. Like, this thing is beautiful. That is a beautiful point right there. That looks like it would take some time compared to these.
The way to look at these is they're all sophisticated tools, and they're designed and made in ways that accommodates what the user needs them to function as. So these triangular end scrapers, they're not difficult to make. You can knock a flake of stone off and turn it over, and with a small cobble, knock flakes off around the edge. And you can make one of these tools within 5 minutes. And then you can insert it in a bone handle, and you're good to go for working caribou hide or whatever you're going to modify with that. Other tools like this is called a side scraper, and it's the same kind of thing. It's not extensively flaked. They just took a big flake, flipped it over, used a small hammerstone or an antler baton, knocked off a series of flakes, and what you end up with then is either a curved or a straight edge that you can use. You can hold in your hand, and you can use it for cutting or scraping. So it's for modifying things like bone or antler or wood, or maybe animal hide too. Here's another tool. Like those end scrapers, this would have been hafted, and that's suggested in part by the way it was made. They took a big flake, They knock flakes off very intensively on either side in one direction, so you end up with this narrow outline. Archaeologists call this a lamasse, which is French for slug, because you see tools like this in the Upper Paleolithic and in parts of Europe. But they also drove a flake off here. And so this was designed to be inserted in a bone haft as well. And when
Okay, I can see it now. When you hold it, I can see it.
When you do that, if you imagine that my hand is a piece of antler or bone, the amount of leverage that you can exert on that tool is multiplied well over 100-fold. Microscopic studies of the business end of this particular kind of tool, this tip here, shows that there are very long striations on that tip at a microscopic level, and this was probably used for cutting into or slotting bone or wood or antler. So it's a toolkit for hunting and for processing animal products primarily, and so that suggests to us these people are primarily hunters. That also makes sense because they're living in a subarctic landscape where animals are present maybe in the summer and they're gone in the winter from a particular location. It's a highly seasonal climate, and animal resources that they survived on were highly seasonal too. So caribou are there one day, they're gone the next. So it's a very lightweight, portable toolkit that they can carry as they're moving literally hundreds of miles, probably mostly on foot. They may have had boats. But the way that these sites are located on the landscape relative to the geologic sources of the stone, they're not just going downstream on a boat. They're going at all different directions across these landscapes.
I can't help but when I hear stories like this and see these things, just think about the people. It's impossible to not think about the guy or the girl who made these things. Who was the first guy to figure it out? Who found this rock? And because it had to happen probably by accident, right? Like found a flake, like cut himself on it or something. Like, whoa, this is really sharp. I could kill things with this. Yeah. I always try to visualize that story because it had to have happened, something like that.
Well, you're right.
And then that guy tells everyone else. And
it surely did, and that's one of the things that makes Homo sapiens such an adaptive species is cultural behavior can be learned through language and imitation. Some other animals do that too. So chimpanzees use sticks to pull termites out of termite mounds. If you saw the Jane Goodall film that was on National Geographic last night, they also use an anvil stone and a hammer stone, and they'll use that for cracking nuts. And primatologists have studied tool using by chimpanzees, for example, and unlike humans, that process of learning is not by language, but by imitation. There are very telling photographs of juvenile chimpanzees watching their mother crack open nuts on an anvil with a hammer stone. And they can end up producing the equivalent of archaeological sites that you could think, well, is this human? But primatologists and archaeologists have studied the debris that chimpanzees leave behind by those activities, and you can discriminate from human archaeological sites. But the whole process of human use of stone tools is fascinating. The oldest the oldest sites of human-made stone tools, I believe, date to about 3.3 million years ago. For a while it was 2.6, now it's 3.3, based on some recent research by paleoanthropologists from SUNY Stony Brook in Africa. And it's the first time that you see evidence of humans being able to take a piece of stone and then using a hammer stone as a percussor to knock flakes off that piece of stone and shape it, either to shape it or just to create tools by knocking flakes off. And then you pick up those flakes and you've got a ready-made cutting edge that you can then use to help butcher an animal.
So 3.3 million years ago, were we still half monkeys? Were we still half chimps at this point?
Well,
because what?
That's a fundamental question that paleoanthropologists are constantly debating. We're not Homo sapiens yet. There is genus Homo is on the landscape, but what we originally thought back in the 60s when National Geographic was broadcasting films by Louis Leakey about his work in Olduvai Gorge, everyone thought all you had to do was find the missing link in the fossil record. And what paleoanthropologists, human paleontologists understand now is that as time goes on, they realize there has been a significant discovery bias in the human fossil record. And it's not a single line of evolution from genus Homo to Homo sapiens. It's a branching tree, and many lines of early hominids went extinct, and one did not, and that's where we came from. So the human fossil record in Africa is far more complex than anyone envisioned just 30, 40 years ago. And it's becoming more complex all the time, and people are defining these new species that are being given names, and the relationships of the degree to which these species, these hominid species were contemporaneous. That's a matter of debate as well. And of course, when you're dealing with millions of years ago, your ability to date those precisely there's a limit to our resolution in our dating. So 30, 40 years ago, is that when we discovered Lucy? Lucy, I think Donald Johansen found Lucy. I think it was in the early 70s.
Because I remember growing up learning, that's it. Yes. We found Lucy. We're done. Well, we know that's the missing link.
It was a groundbreaking discovery, Australopithecus afarensis, and people thought, well, this is very significant, and it's still significant, but it's not the only story of what came before genus Homo in that 3 million year and back time range.
I saw a couple of years. Have you seen Lucy in the museum? It was the Museum of Natural History in D.C. is believe where I saw her 2 years ago, and I was like, that's it. All right, but even then, 2 years ago, it's like we've already pushed the bar back since then, based on the new discoveries. Like it seems like I talked before we even started. I'm like, I had a dream of being a little kid archaeologist, but at that time I was like 10, 11 years old. I was naive, and I thought, oh, we discovered everything. There's nothing left. But now,
and that's how human paleontologists were thinking 30, 20 years ago, and it's simply not true. It's what anthropologists call it and geologists call it discovery bias. That many of these things are found by dedicated field research, but your ability to find what's out there is dependent on the geology in a particular region. What rock, soil layers of a particular age from 4 million, 3 million, 2 million years ago are exposed in a particular locality, and what's exposed on the surface as an area is eroding, that's where you're making your discoveries. But that doesn't mean that everything that's in that geological stratum, you haven't found everything that's in that geological stratum. You're just finding what's available there to be found at the particular moment.
And is carbon dating still our best method of determining how old these are, how old anything we find in the geological strata?
Radiocarbon dating is great for archaeological sites that date to or geological settings that are less than 50,000 years old. It's an isotopic dating method that involves half-lives, and when you get more than 50,000 years back with radiocarbon, C13, C14, it's simply not, it's no longer feasible at that age to date it. So then you have to resort to other methods. So there's other kinds of radiometric dating methods. There's also OSL dating, which measures stored light in individual sand grains.
What?
Yeah, optically stimulated luminescence. So
this is going to hurt my brain. Please try to explain.
So that can go significantly further back than 50,000 years, but there are also radiometric dating methods involving other elements, other isotopes that can take you back several million years. And though that's mostly the purview of geologists and human paleontologists who are dealing with timescales of 1 million, 2 million, 3 million years ago. Here in New York, it's all less than about 13,000 years ago. So that's radiocarbon dating is good for us.
So you've narrowed our focus. In New York, we're like 13,000. We don't need to go back further than that.
Currently, there's no widely accepted evidence for archaeological sites dating early than 13,000 years ago in New York.
Now, do we have, I guess the only remaining thing would be oral history of these New York American Indian tribes that these were their ancestors, correct? Do we have any oral history what the Native American tribes described their arrival in New York? You kind of hit upon that earlier.
Origin stories of the Iroquois and the Mohican, for example, view their origin less as not as a migration so much as descending from ancestral beings. So in the Iroquois, it's Sky Woman coming down to Earth, and so. That's part of what I referenced earlier about the difference in the narratives of Native groups and their own cultural origin stories, which have their view of the past, and archaeologists and geologists and the information that they use or data that they use just creates a different and sometimes conflicting view of the past. And in the case of Native Americans, how they got here and how long they've been here and what was the nature of their tenure over those thousands of years.
Do you ever work with the tribes in New York? Because do we still have Iroquois? And I used to live up in St. Lawrence County. It was the Akwesasne
Reservation.
Akwesasne,
yes,
yeah.
Yes. The Iroquois or Haudenosaunee are still here. The Mohican are still here. I'm dealing here with a time period of 12,000 years ago. So they're aware of these kinds of findings. They don't necessarily agree with it. And, as I said, it's their view of the past. It's versus another view of the past based on different kinds of information.
What don't they agree with? I mean,
well, like I said, Iroquois Mohican origin stories, they do not view their people as having migrated in from somewhere else.
Okay, so they're not laying claim to any of these sites that you discover in New York State?
Well, they recognize them as Native American sites of broadly speaking, of ancestral Native American groups. But again, they've got a different view of the past, which is just as legitimate but different.
Gotcha. Because I have some memories when I used to live up in St. Lawrence County. We get the Canadian news, and one of the news stories was they were digging a hole for some development outside of Ottawa, I think, and they found a burial ground. And I forget the tribe. I love in Canada, they call them the First Nations people. I think that's a fantastic name. We got to look a little confused here, like Native American, American Indian. I think First Nations is a really cool name.
The term is used here too.
First Nations?
Yes.
Maybe amongst people know.
It's the same concept.
It's a cool name. So I forget the tribe, but they laid claim to it and they had a halt. I'm sure you've heard of this over the years, plenty of this time. Like they have to halt construction, and because this tribe is laying claim to that. So I always just wonder, like, how far back does that go for these Native Americans or First Nation tribes? Apparently not this far back, right? Like 13,000 years, the Iroquois aren't
this
saying...
is an origin story that their individual origin stories don't so much have a precise chronological time scale attached to them.
Okay.
That's another difference in these two kinds of narratives. One based on archaeology, which has a very explicit chronological time scale, and Native American origin stories in New York and elsewhere that that's not so much part of the story.
So they don't agree that 13,000 years, whatever it might be.
Well, I think it I don't want to speak for them. I think it depends on different individuals have different views of the past, and some of them might accept what radiocarbon dates suggest. Others may not.
Gotcha.
That's a future guest for you.
Yeah, that actually is a guest, a pending guest of mine. He is I do forget the name of the tribe, but it's like a gathering of the tribes out in, I think it's outside of Winnetzkill. I pronounce all these New York names wrong. But there was a powwow we went to last summer, and it had all these tribes, 10, 12 tribes from around the country. And the guy who runs it is a friend of mine's friend. And so he's going to be on the podcast eventually, because I love to hear his stories.
Yes.
I love to, if he's a guy willing to have like 10,000 people out for this powwow, I'm sure he's willing to sit down and talk a bit. That's what my friend says. He would love to talk.
And he could give you his personal perspective on a lot of these questions, as well as broader native perspectives on the question.
Yeah, I love hearing perspectives. That's my goal. I like to hear, give me all the information and let me figure it out. Have you tried making any of these things? Because to me, they seem like you describe these as not so hard to make, but I've seen people try to do this, and they've said it takes years and decades to.
Well, there are people out there. This process of making stone tools by percussion is called Flint Nappers. There are people who train themselves to be Flint Nappers. Basically, by training themselves to do this, you can better understand how this ancient technology is manufactured and used. And some of these people are incredibly skilled. They've been learning how to do it literally in some cases for years or decades. I received some teaching when I was in graduate school from an expert flint napper, and I learned how to do it a little bit, so I can make some of these tools like these end scrapers and side scrapers here, but I do not have anywhere near the skill or expertise needed to make a fluted point. I can make a very rough biface, which would be called a preform, because it's essentially an unfinished fluted point like it is here, but I could never get beyond this rough out stage here.
See, that's another thing that I think about too, is if these people 13,000 years ago saw us today and we had no idea how to make that, they're like, what? Because I think about all the time, it's kind of a weird fixation I have. What happens if the lights go out? What life skills do I have? Can I hunt? No. I could fish a little bit, but no, I can't hunt. Can I make tools? No. Am I wrong in putting these? I kind of romanticize this. I think a way a lot of people do. Like, they're connected to nature. They knew how to do useful things. I feel very useless sometimes. I'm like, if the lights go off, what can I do?
Well, it's an interesting idea, because if you think about it, all of us today grew up in a built environment. In the Albany, Troy area, you have roads and buildings and highway bridges and rail lines, and we are transported across that built environment by our technology, and we live in that built environment. A few of us go out and camp for a weekend somewhere, but we are a way to think about these early peoples and their connection to the landscape is that, by comparison to us, we're almost totally divorced from the natural landscape. We can appreciate it at a certain level, but we live in a world that's been modified and built up by our technology, and we lack the basic understandings of animal behavior and the natural world around those subarctic animals that these people clearly had a deep understanding of and appreciation for, which was essential for them to survive in this landscape. You
just said something we don't understand nature, the animals. however you just said it. You reminded me. Here's an absurd thing about here in Troy. There's, do you know about our crows that fly in Troy? Every sunset, every night, they fly from just around where Green Island is, and it's like 1,000 or 2,000 crows just every night. And some people describe it as a crow problem, and that we need to get rid of these crows. Like, what? We share this. They're just crows fly. Like, we are so divorced from nature, from this connection that these people had, that if we see a wild animal, it's just a crow. It's not even what we would typically describe as a wild animal. We're like, no, gotta get rid of it. Get it out of here. I don't want to see that. So it really, when I hear someone say that, because there's a bunch of them, this comes up in the newspapers, in like bid meetings and the Troy City Council meetings. I'm like, why are we talking about crows? They live here with us. So whenever I have these conversations about people that are really connected with nature, I'm like, people need to go camping. Like, we share this land. And I think I get really romantic about this stuff. That's why I couldn't wait to talk to you and hear what you had to say. Because these things, I'm just like, I feel like there's something special about these. Like, people made these.
Well, it is. These are some of the oldest human-made artifacts in New York State, and the fact that we have these in the New York State Museum helps to connect us to our collective past here in New York. The same with the historical archaeological collections that we have that tell us about the Dutch history here and the British history. Another way to think about these peoples is in the 1700s, 1800s, early 1900s, explorers and then anthropologists and archaeologists spent time with hunting peoples that were still present, not here in New York, but for example, up in Labrador, the Innu people, originally known as the Montagnais-Naskapi, who were caribou hunters, and to some extent, for example, those and other people like subarctic peoples further west, like the Chippewayan, who also relied heavily on caribou, which we believe these people did too. From those studies from the 1800s, early 1900s, when there were still thriving, active hunting cultures that had not been heavily affected by Western technology, what people saw with those, what those archaeologists and anthropologists learned as studying those people is, again, this deep understanding of the animal behavior and how from one season to the next, what your strategy would be for hunting those animals depending on where you were and what was the appropriate strategy. And likewise, what was the appropriate treatment of those animals, because it's not like a modern deer hunter who goes out, kills a deer and brings it home in the back of the pickup truck, takes it to the butcher. There's these people view these animals as being associated with larger animal spirits that inhabit the broader natural world, and their ability to kill one of those animals, a caribou for example, so that they can survive on that landscape, is viewed as essentially a gift from these animal spirits, and that animal has presented itself to them to be taken by hunting. And once that animal is killed, there are appropriate behaviors and what some might call rituals as to how that deceased animal should be treated before it's butchered and used to consume or to create hide clothing or whatever. And so that's another very different aspect that was likely true, we'll never know, but was likely true for these early peoples too, that they're looking at the world and the animals in it as animistic spirits, and it's all connected, and their behavior and how they behaved in this natural world was just as critical to their survival this appropriate cultural behavior and treatment of animals was just as important to their survival, likely, as the actual killing of that caribou. So it's a very, needless to say, it's a very different way of viewing the natural world.
They were us, but they weren't us, in a way, in many ways. If you could...
It's a totally different way from a monotheistic Christianity-based religion as a larger view of...
These were earth lovers, right? Earth lovers, nature lovers.
You could think about it that way.
I do, because I'm an earth lover, nature. When you talk about camping, I can't wait for camping season to start. I can't wait. We got a puppy 6-7 months ago with the intention of protecting us from bears, just because I'm assuming I'm going to see a bear someday the places I go camping. Here's a silly question. Do you know, are you familiar with the Munsee tribe at all through here? That's why I named my dog Munsee, after that tribe, because they known as the wolf tribe. He's a little wolf, my dog. So all I got from gathering, I don't even know why this is a topic, but I feel I have to say it. Like, only thing I gathered about the Munsee tribe, there were all these little tribes, just like the Munsee tribe, scattered throughout the region, and they were just kind of absorbed into what we would call the Iroquois, or these bigger tribes, right?
Well, they were Mohican, and so a different language, and they, unlike the Iroquois, a confederacy was never formed. And their settlements tended to be on the smaller size. They didn't have these very large palisaded villages with long houses that might be 100 or 200 feet long with many, many families in them. So they were living in smaller settlements in the Hudson Valley, for example.
Good. So I named my dog after them because I found out they were the wolf tribe.
There you go.
Now, undoubtedly, this is an awesome time to be alive. It's great to have roads, to have shops, to have Troy, to divorce ourselves from nature in a way, right? But if you could go back to any time period, just maybe as an observer, maybe not live there full time, because I don't think I'd ever want to live in this world. I would die probably pretty quick. But is there a time period you would like to go back and observe? Is it the Pleistocene era?
Yes, I'd like to go back to that late Ice Age landscape and environment and see how these people were.
Is it because you have so many questions, because you know so much?
Well, I've been interested in archaeology for a long time. This particular period of earliest Native American prehistory in the New York region has always been particularly fascinating to me. So personally, it's what I'm most interested in.
Would you want to go back there and actually live, or just to go back and observe?
Well, life would be probably shorter, but it would be fascinating to witness it firsthand.
I agree. Yeah, I'm too soft for this. Are you a hunter now?
No.
Have you ever been hunting?
Yes.
Have you ever seen... I've only been hunting a couple times. I haven't even seen an animal to kill. So when we talk about these people were making handmade tools, and you had to get close to throw these, what are they called again?
Atlatls. And dart shafts.
How far of a distance would we have to kill?
Well, there are modern competitions. There's an atlatl. There are people who replicate these atlatls, or prehistoric technology enthusiasts, and this atlatls can be thrown hundreds of feet. And at shorter range, they can be pretty accurate. One of the ways to think about these people and their hunting is that probably some of it didn't just involve stalking these animals and killing them, but they were using other techniques that could elevate their success rate. So records of subarctic peoples in the early 20th century, 19th century, 18th century, they're sometimes, with caribou in particular, in the subarctic landscapes, they're setting up sticks or piles of rocks in a row. And a caribou will find that that will disturb their pattern of movement on the landscape, and that will tend to channel their behavior. And so these are essentially, they're called drive lanes. And you can set up these drive lanes to sort of work in a funnel-like fashion, and then set up a corral at the end of those drive lanes, which the animals could have been driven into, and then could become where they could have been caught in snares, or they could have been killed with dart shafts.
That's genius to have figured that out.
Yeah, and again, that's their understanding of the behavior of all the different species, but including caribou, and how you can manipulate their environment to enhance your hunting success rate.
Wow, that's an incredible thing I've never heard of.
Yeah.
Wow, how much longer from throwing the atlatls, from that period to creating the bow and arrow? When did the bow and arrow? When do we think that happened?
Well, it tends to show up at different times in New York. The traditional explanation is that small stone arrow tips, which are sometimes notched, sometimes triangular in shape, show up around 1,000 years ago, and that's the traditional narrative about when bow and arrow technology, which is believed to have diffused into New York State, was not invented here, but that's when it's believed to have made its appearance, and that it was used in hunting. Some insight into this kind of question. It's not just finding the weapons tips, but with modern abrupt climate change that we face today, what you see in these Arctic and subarctic regions is you find remnants of glaciers or ice patches, and artifacts are melting out of those ice patches. And that's significant because, returning to caribou, in the summer, they typically migrate to these more open regions, first for calving in the spring, and while they've moved into these more open regions, the weather in the summer turns warm. They're being tormented by fierce biting flies, and the only way for them to get away from them is to go hang out on a glacier or an ice patch where the ambient air temperature is reduced, and those flies won't follow them onto that. And what we find today with these melting ice patches is that you're finding sheet deposits, stratified deposits of caribou scat interleaved between layers of ice and snow. And you're also finding hunting weaponry that was left there by people who are hunting those caribou, and it almost certainly was in the summer, taking advantage of this behavior of caribou in the summer to go hang out on an ice patch to get away from biting flies.
Wow.
And the technology that is melting out of those ice patches and glaciers is, initially, it's an atlatl dart shaft hunting technology. In different areas, it's replaced by bow and arrow technology. For example, in the Western Canadian subarctic, it's replaced, I believe, about 1000 AD.
And this is all recent discovery.
And so what they can do, what they're finding is those stone weapons tips still hafted in the arrow shaft or the dart shaft that was propelled by an atlatl, and you can then radiocarbon date that organic component of the technology, the wooden shaft, dart or arrow shaft, and get a precise age on how old when that artifact was made, or when the wood from the tree died that was used to make that shaft, and then a stone weapons tip was hafted to.
Wow, I haven't heard too many positives about global warming. This sounds like a pretty cool
archaeologically,
thing.
that's one positive. There are plenty of negatives, but it's an intriguing insight that's occurred because of.
And this is all typically northern, western Canada that this is mostly happening?
Alaska and Canada. It's also been observed in places like Norway, where there was also subarctic environments where people hunted caribou going back thousands of years as well.
Would that be the Vikings up in Norway?
And they're yes.
So are they finding metal? Because Native Americans had no metallurgical evidence, right? Is that the idea? But places like the Vikings did at the same time?
They're finding metal artifacts from more recent times as well.
In America?
No, excuse me, in places like Norway.
Okay, all right. Because we found none of that in the United States or North America, right?
There's one definitive site, Lonesome Meadows, which is in Quebec.
That there is?
Yes.
And how do we get that metal there?
Well, it's a Viking site.
Okay, it's a Viking site. All right. Oh, that's another thing I've seen the last few years. We keep finding all these new old Viking sites up in Nova Scotia area, right? Like
there's a limited number of them, but they are there.
There's one that was really, really, really isolated that I saw recently. I'm like, how did anybody even find out how to get there? Mm-hmm. But that's a whole different.
The Vikings were amazing explorers with a very sophisticated maritime technology with their ships, and so they moved west to Iceland, populated Iceland, and moved west from there to the northern Atlantic region too.
Do the Vikings have
they
any
did not
record?
Establish a permanent footprint there. None of these sites were occupied for long.
It was kind of like they showed up, like, okay, not for us. Let's get out of here.
Did they have any way from home?
Do they have any? Are there any Viking records? Well, I don't know. Did they write anything down about just meeting anyone in North America?
There are Viking texts, yes, and people study those, and they have legitimate insight, but they are they're not they can't they my understanding, and I have very little background in this, but my understanding is that you can study these texts, but you can't take them too literally in every aspect of what you're reading on these Viking texts. So it's something that can be coupled with the archaeology to provide insight into the past, the Viking past.
What's the coolest thing at the museum?
At the New York State Museum?
Yeah.
Well, our Mastodon is our mascot is the Cohoes Mastodon, which is quite amazing. And our vertebrate paleontologist has studied that animal, and it's been radiocarbon dated, and the circumstances of his demise are well documented. He was in a battle with another mastodon and had his skull punctured by the tusk of another mastodon, and he's one of our local heroes. Discovered in I believe it was 1860 or 1865 by Ed Hull, the first state geologist. So that's one of my favorite artifacts at the New York State Museum.
Do you walk by him every morning?
In addition to the archaeology. No, he's in a gallery that I don't walk past to get to my office.
All right. Do you have any digs planned? Do you have any trips? Do you take like a summer, go to Alaska or something like that?
Well, our research is focused in New York State because that's our larger mission of the New York State Museum is to assemble these collections that are archaeology, geology, biology, history, and they are a legacy, a cultural legacy for all New Yorkers. And it's also part of, so we assemble these collections, we curate them, we care for them, and we help disseminate information on those collections through publications and public education programs and presentations. So I forget what your question was.
Did you have any plans on going on any digs?
Yes. So yeah, we're actively researching these early peoples. We've been working on a site for the last few years up in central New York, in Madison County. That's one of these fluted point sites.
So
and we spend a few weeks there every summer.
Capital region: Troy, Albany, Schenectady, even southern Adirondacks, or even crossing over to Vermont and Berkshires, maybe. Is there any chance I'm going to find an arrowhead? Because I told you that's one of my dreams, walking along a river, a stream in the woods with my dog, and I'm dying to find an arrowhead someday.
Sure. It could happen.
I've been waiting 30 years.
It's a matter of both being in the right place where that artifact is and recognizing it.
The recognizing part seems to be tricky.
Yes.
Like
and
this.
If you'd spent years looking for these, you become clued in to what to look for. What distinguishes this from a natural piece of stone.
So if I ever find something
I can't guarantee you.
So if I do find something that I'm like, maybe this is it. Maybe this is an arrowhead. Maybe this is an atlatl head. Maybe I take a picture and send it to you.
Yes.
All right. I'll try not to waste your time, but like that. Yeah, you're right. It has to be you have to have a refined eye, but it is a dream of mine, and typically it's near bodies of water, right? Would that be more likely?
Native American archaeological sites are often in valleys, near rivers or lakes, but they're also based on their history. So, for example, with the Iroquois, in the latter parts of their time in New York, with the establishment of these palisaded villages, at certain times these villages tend to be located in more upland settings because they were easier to defend against. So, not all sites are near rivers or lakes, but many are.
Defend against what? Each other, right?
Yes.
Because there's another perception that people have that
group conflict.
That pre-colonial America, everybody was getting along, lovey-dovey. They were humans, and humans fight.
Yeah, there were times of significant conflict between different groups, and that's why they were building walls around their longhouses.
You guys have longhouses at the museum, right?
We have dioramas, yes.
Okay.
And both a full-sized longhouse interior as well as renderings and smaller scale models of longhouse villages.
And that is typical of this area. And how much further west? Because I felt like
it's typical of the Mohawk Valley west to western New York, which is the extent of the Iroquois Confederacy. In the Hudson Valley proper, which was traditionally occupied by Mohican groups, but at times that was a zone of tension between, for example, the Mohawk and Mohican groups. So the territories between these, or the boundaries between these territories of these different groups shifted at different times.
Okay. I think I've been in that longhouse at the museum. Mm-hmm. I'm thinking I might be confusing that with no, because there was the Native American Museum in DC as well, which was pretty cool. I don't know if they had the longhouse, and then we went to one in Ottawa, Canada as well. I love American Indian history. That's why fantastic talking with you today. All right, you want to wrap it up? This is unless you what fascinates you the most. That is my question. Just this whole world.
What fascinates me most is these earliest peoples in the New York region and how they were surviving in what was still an Ice Age environment, and the artifacts are the main route that we have to understand that from my perspective as an archaeologist. And it's a fascinating story, and we're learning more about these early peoples all the time as sites are excavated and artifacts are found across the state and recorded and studied. So it's a wonderful window into this ancient past of New York.
Now, do you go out and teach classes or schools?
Some of our curators at the museum do that. I don't.
Is this your first podcast?
Yes, it is.
Bravo. This has been fantastic. Dr. Jon Lothrop, right?
Yes.
Lothrop? All right. Bye, everyone. Thank you. This has been a lot of fun, man. Thank you.
Right,
fantastic.